Okay everybody, we're on to part 8. This is reading data from our database, part 2, so let's jump straight into it. We are going to, why are we doing it first of all? So in the last section we created a task and there was no feedback for the user that a task had been created, and our data grid is also looking pretty lonely and empty. So really what should happen is when we start the application we should display all the tasks that we have already in the data grid, and whenever we create a new task, it should be created in the data grid. So that's what we're going to do in this section. And we're going to use linq to do that. We're going to write a linq query to retrieve our tasks from the database and put it into the data grid. So in order to do that, we need to create a binding source. Technically we don't, and I'll show you why we don't, but we're going to do it anyway as Microsoft recommends that's the approach you take. It's very simple. We're going to create a linq query using query methodology. Now there are two ways you can write linq queries, using what's called linq query method, or linq extension methods. Extension methods use lambda expressions. If you're familiar with them, you can use that, or if you're not familiar with it, then read up on it. I'm not going to go into it here because it would just take too long, but there are two ways you can do it to get the same result. And then we're going to bind our data source, which is effectively our linq query. Our linq query is our data source. We're going to ultimately bind that to our data grid via the binding source. Sounds a bit convoluted, and then we're going to refresh our data grid. So let's jump straight into that. It will become a bit clearer in the code. Whoops, there was something else there. Oh yes, I just had, if I just bring that back up, I just had linq query method versus extension method, which I've already covered. So. Okay, so in our code, we're going to basically create a function, because we're going to call this function multiple times. We'll call it once when we start up our application, and we'll call it once after we've created something or deleted something or updated something. So it's going to be used multiple times. So we'll call it private void refresh data void. There you go. I've had a really long day at work today and I'm quite tired, so I'm probably going to make loads of mistakes. So the first thing we'll do is create a binding source. Now if you want to read more about what a binding source is and why we'd use it, again it's on the blog article. It's basically an intermediary object that Microsoft recommends you bind your data grids to. It provides a number of features that are useful. So we're going to use it. You can actually bind the data grid directly to the query, but we're not going to do that. We're going to follow procedure and use a binding source. It's not a big deal. Equals new binding source. Cool. Alright, now the next bit is super important and you're probably most interested in. We're going to write a query. So we declare a variable, we'll call it query. Let me just write the query, this first line of the query first, before I tell you what it is, otherwise it will just be super confusing. Oh. Okay, so basically what we're saying here is we want everything from our TM context, which is our DB context, tasks. So we'll give us everything and we'll call it, refer to it as T from our TM DB context tasks collection. We want to order by, we'll say due date. And this looks very similar to SQL, if any of you have done SQL. And then, unlike SQL, our select command comes last. So this is where we select the columns that we want to present. So we provide a list of those. I wouldn't ordinarily pull back the ID, but for this video I'm pulling back the ID because we use that when we come to delete and update. So we just pull that back. It's a bit crude, but pull it back. We want the name of our task, so we just, again, I'll show you, we refer to everything using the T dot, and then we get a list of task attributes. Name, fantastic. Next we want to understand what the status of our task is. So this is where this navigation property comes in. Remember when I talked about navigation properties? So again, T dot, instead of status ID, which is just a numeric identifier, we actually don't want that. We want to refer to the status object that it's linked to. Fantastic. Dot again, and then the name of that status. So it will be to do or update or whatever, in progress, whatever they are. And then finally T due date. Fantastic. So that's our query complete. Just put a semicolon in there, and in that query variable will be our list. Now you can see here that there's an error. Now, what that error is basically we have two attributes, each called name, and it's a bit confused by that. It doesn't like that. Even though it's the name of the status object and the name of the task object, it still finds it ambiguous. So a simple way to get around that is to give each of these an alias. So we'll call t name, we'll call that task name, and you can see the error's actually gone now, but just to, for completeness, we'll call this status name equals t status.name. Fantastic. That caught me out. It took me a wee while to figure out what was going on there. So I've been good to you, and I've saved you a lot of pain there. Although it wouldn't be a very good tutorial if I gave you error-ridden code. So we now set the data source of our binding source to that. Equals query, and we want to change it to a list. Fantastic. And then we want to bind our data grid views data source to our binding source. So as I said, it's a little bit convoluted. Now what you could do, instead of doing that, you could just set the data grid views data source to the query list to list, as we've done up there, to list. We could do that. And that seems to work okay, and you don't need to use a binding source. I'm going to use a binding source because it's simply recommended. So I suggest you do it too. And on the blog site, there's an article on the whys and wherefores that I'm not going to bore you with right now. And then we need to refresh our data grid view to get an update. So we're going to call this in multiple places. We will call it after our form has started up. So when you start up, you'll give a list of tasks in there. And we'll also call it after we've successfully created a new task. So let's see, compile that works, start it. So hopefully we'll know it's worked, because there we go. I actually added another task in there, have a coffee. Let's have some chocolate. It's not really a hard task. That's way off, isn't it? Chocolate. The O key on my keyboard's broken as well. I'm having a terrible time. And we'll set the status to do. So we create that. There we go. It's called again, and it's refreshed our grid, and it's a better user experience for our user because it's fed back that those queries are in our database. Just to double check, if we just run a select all, they are actually in our database if we go directly there. Cool. So we've got 2 more sections to go. You'll be pleased to hear deleting data from our database and data grid and updating data. So they're next.